Desta disappears. She'll be here, but
I'm in the background only.
okay.
I'm recording.
And I'll record. So wait.
We're going to take about a 4-minute break at the top of the hour, Preston, in case we go over an hour. And we're try to shut it down. Hour and 15, hour and a half at the most, I think. Right, Nikki?
As long as you guys want to go, I'm good. I'm drinking coffee, so. Dolan set the precedent with 5 hours, so.
There you go, yeah.
Somebody has to beat it sometime.
But then at the end of it, you got to say what Mike Clellan says. If you come this far, thanks for listening.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Not many people will listen to 5 hours.
Well, Preston, how long do you keep your shows usually? You're doing them pretty regularly now, like your presentations.
Yeah, I've got them all over the map.
Yeah.
You know, I just let it kind of fall out organically, I guess.
Yeah, I like that though. I'm just starting to follow people consistently on YouTube and like join their chats and things like that. So I've been stalking you for a couple weeks now.
You stole my line. I'm going to use that line in the intro. You're not supposed to use that line. I'm going to use that.
Yeah, I've been putting out a video per week. So
good.
Ramping it up, trying to save the world.
There you go.
Okay, Grant, you want to do a 5-second countdown and I'll start recording and I'll mute here?
Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. This is Grant Cameron, and I have a special guest tonight, Preston Dennett, who I've known for a number of years. I am also joined by my local assistant and producer, Desta Barnaby, who will be in the background on this show, and Nikki Sakic, who is a research assistant of mine in Illinois. Welcome, Desta and Nikki.
Hi, Grant.
Hello.
Hi, Preston.
We have Preston on here for one reason. Nikki was stalking Preston. She was watching his stuff. And she would send me his stuff, and she said, do you know this guy? I said, yeah, I know this guy. Do you want to interview him? She said, yeah, I'd like to interview this guy. So that's why we have Preston on tonight. And I'll give you a little rundown of who Preston is. Preston Dennett began investigating UFOs and the paranormal in 1986 when he discovered that his family, friends, and co-workers were having dramatic, unexplained encounters. Since then, he has interviewed hundreds of witnesses and investigated a wide range of paranormal phenomena. He's a field investigator for the MUFON Mutual Network, a ghost hunter, a paranormal researcher, and the author of 26 books and more than 100 articles on UFOs. So welcome, Preston. And my first question is going to be 26 books. I was thinking of kind of a joke between you and Kevin Randall and Nick Redfern. You guys could open your own library. I mean, do you write every day? Do you have a regiment in terms of putting out this many books?
I wouldn't say I write every day. I spend a lot of time, researching as well. And the writing is sort of the easy part. But yeah, I'm lining them up. I've got a lot of books I still want to write, honestly.
Yeah.
I enjoy it. I think that's the real secret. For me, it's not work.
Wow. Because that's an incredible collection. And we're going to go through some of them. Basically, the things we wanted to talk to you about to start are, I was very interested. I think I talked to you at one conference about your work on people who've been healed on UFOs. And I had some cases. I said to you that if you ever do a second book, I've got a few cases that you weren't in your first book. But that was, I think, 103 cases, correct, of people who had healing encounters. And now you're working with Joe Burks. You did an article for the Free Foundation. So can you maybe start by that and talk a little bit about that? And then I'll throw it to Nikki, who's probably got 100 questions, and she can ask you whatever she wants to ask you. But I'd like to know about this healing thing, because I think it's a kind of important thing. You always hear the story that, people are scared and are they here to eat us and stuff like this. And this sort of goes counter to all that. So what have you concluded? Because you did this book a number of years ago, correct?
Yeah, that was actually my first book, UFO Healings. I had a firsthand case. This lady was healed of a tumor. She went to the doctor, there was diagnosis, had an experience, went back, and the doctor's like, well, you had surgery or something. Your tumor is missing, and there's fluid here that's only present after surgery, which she denied because she hadn't had surgery, not at, at the hospital. So that got me into it, and I collected, I knew of some other real famous cases. Police officer healed by a beam of light, healed him of a wound on his finger. There were some other well-known cases in the literature. A doctor in France who was cured of an axe wound on his foot and partial paralysis by a beam of light, again from a UFO. That's from Jacques Vallée, great researcher. So following the publication of that book, yeah, I kept getting reports. Every time I spoke about it, someone would come up to me. And I got a lot of letters, now emails.
Wow.
And I always thought it was kind of a rare thing. I knew it turned up, but I've kind of reversed my opinions on that now for a couple of...
Yeah, I think the free survey, doesn't the free survey show 50% of all experiencers who answered the question said they or someone in their family have been healed, and then 50% of them claimed they could heal other people? Isn't that their figure that they were using?
Yeah, and I surveyed the literature. It's a little misleading, I think, to say 50% have been healed, because a lot of people interpret their experience of healing in kind of a perhaps spiritual way, as opposed to a physical healing, which I would call a first-class case. But I was always curious about how common this was. And I have to say, I think it's much more common than I originally thought.
Are you doing a second book on it?
There's the 300 true accounts. Yeah, I put it out.
Okay.
Yeah,
so you've got 2 books and you're still getting emails. Let me ask one more question before I throw it to Nikki. And that is, have you talked to Travis Walton? Because there's this controversy about Travis Walton and his situation, whether he was dead, or did you ever talk to him about his experience?
No, not personally, but I was certainly interested to see him kind of come to that conclusion, because I think it's a possibility. But it's hard for me to say it was his experience. But it's, how would you know, unless you have direct evidence of it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't think UFO healings are 50%. I know Edith Fiore, PhD, she had a bunch of healings and said half of her clients had this. But I can tell you most major researchers have uncovered UFO healings. Bud Hopkins, John Mack, David Jacobs, Barbara Lamb, Yvonne Smith. I mean, I can go down the list.
Hey, Preston, I think was Grant number 8 on your top 20? Was that the number in his case?
Yeah, the Chris Bledsoe case I found very impressive. Having met him, he was obviously a very sincere guy.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was really good evidence, because that's the kind of chronic condition you can't fake, not for that long.
Yeah.
And when you're on loads of medication and everyone around you knows you're dealing with this, and his sighting was widely viewed by their witnesses. I mean, you're the guy. Who am I talking to on that case? But yeah, I thought it was a great case.
Yeah.
Well,
let me ask one last question before I go to Nikki. What's your conclusion? Why do you think they're doing this, or why do you think this is happening? Before we leave the healing thing, have you got any hypotheses?
I know it's one of their main agendas, because I think it's highly underreported. Yeah, I documented some 300 cases. I think it's probably 100 times that at least, coming from all types of ETs. And I think it sort of does point to a very benevolent side. And it's one of their agendas. You can see when people are taken on board, they're physically examined. Sometimes they're healed. They're given messages, warnings usually, nuclear proliferation, pollution, shown the engine room, told how the craft works, or given information about spirituality, perhaps.
Yeah.
So there's a real fear slant to this, which is in a way understandable, because they are kidnapping people. I can't get around that. But ultimately, I think this is good evidence that their intentions are not hostile in the sense that we would think of it. Because one more thing, what we don't see is like outright sadism on board UFOs. Certainly, I don't get cases like that. or either purposefully trying to hurt people or enjoying people's pain or anything like that.
Good. Okay, Nikki, now you're on. Sorry.
Sorry, once I get going, I just go. I'm learning from you, Grant. I just have to speed it up a little bit. You got to speed it up. But actually, just to back it up, I was kind of following along with you over the last year, honestly, but these two topics seem to keep coming up in conversations we have, whether it's in Grant's rabbit holes or offline. And it's this idea of healing. And also you did one of your programs on plant medicine or healing, or this collecting of biological things like flora and fauna, which linked into your recent post about zoological studies or zoo ships, which I think is fascinating as well. But back to your top 20 UFO healing cases, you did point out something that I thought was rather interesting, which this is actually what I brought up to you, Grant, when I was like, ooh, did you see Preston's post? It's so fascinating. But you brought up this idea, and I even saw you commenting on it along with Facebook, this idea that healing happens to doctors and social workers and police officers, or kind of lifelong contactees. And you've come to kind of discover this possible spin out of goodness, or like this web of, people always say, well, why me, or why this person, when possibly you've stumbled across a pattern where it's because they influence and good things happen by what they get to continue to do with their lives. So I wondered if you could elaborate on that and speak on it, please.
Yeah, because it was one of my main questions, like, why are these people being healed? Why are these people being contacted? And I did find that fully half the cases, I would say, do involve people who are having regular contact. That was the strongest pattern, and really the only one I could find for years, I would say. Because I'm like, well, it's evenly divided between men and women. That's not it. There's very young people healed, babies, little kids. Old people are being healed. Elderly people. A lady was cured of jaundice. Another guy was cured of prostate problems. So that wasn't a pattern. It was clearly not, blood type or race, because these are worldwide distributed. Every country. Canada, US, England, Russia were the top producers. Puerto Rico was, I think, on the top 10 list. And so I started just looking at each case for patterns, and found that, there was that loose pattern of people who are doing good work for humanity in some capacity. And I ran into like 3 social workers in a row. I was like talking to this lady. I'm like, all right, so what do you do? She's like, oh, I'm an art designer, but and I'm talking to her. I'm like, oh, because she was healed of back pain. These grays came in. She has no history of UFO contact at all. They treated her like a rag doll, put the cinch on her back, healed her of chronic back problems. She had been severely injured. And I'm like, okay, an art designer. I'm like, lots of artists, but wasn't convinced until she said, but my true passion is human rights and animal rights activists. And there's the John Hunter Gray case. He's an award-winning civil rights guy. Or a guy interviewed, Michael Carter, was cured of a blood clot in his leg. And so I'm like, okay, there's an awful lot of police officers here too. There's doctors, there's a lot of writers, and artists, and teachers, and entertainers. So like music, how many musicians have had UFO sightings? A lot.
Grant, you're up on that one. How many musicians? I like this theme though. And Grant, have you noticed that with just musicians? And I know you've looked at other artists as well. Do you think, or even maybe another way to put it is, I've heard people talk about prime experiencers, and it's kind of like this blast radius of influence that they have. And do you think you're seeing that in this pattern. It's the blast radius of their good influence, whether it's music or their profession.
You're asking me?
Both of you.
I can just speak to the music thing. I just gave a music lecture last week, and I talked about what Roger Lear, who did the implants, where they asked him what's common between all the people that you did the implants on and the abductees that you deal with. He said there's only one scientific thing I've ever found that fits, and they're all right brain creative people. That's what he said. And this whole idea that the implants are, according to him and Sims, are on the left side of the body, which is run by the right brain. So there's that connection. But I do agree with Destin, because if you look at Olivia Newton-John, had the sighting at 15 years old. She's a big animal rights activist. You know, you find that with the musicians, is that they all have this connection with some sort of mission, civil rights or animal rights or whatever it is. I mean, even I did Joe Wood, who from the Rolling Stones, who's married to Ronnie Wood from the Rolling Stones. She talks about her sighting, and she says that she is a big human rights activist in England, spends a lot of time on different programs and so on. And she had told about this in the story about the plane where her and her 16-year-old son was on there, and the orb comes down the side of the plane, and the kid looks at her and says, "What's that, Mom?" And she says, "I have no idea." And it goes past, and it comes back down the plane on the other side, and they're the only ones on the stone plane that saw it's like everybody else was put in a trance. Nobody else saw this orb moving up and down the side of the plane. And the kid runs a company that tries to get plastic out of the ocean. So there is that pattern that I found the same thing that that Preston has found, is that there's this sort of weird connection, which I guess he gets into, and I don't know if Preston gets into that, the whole thing about the reincarnation thing, that these people may be agreeing to this, and they've come in with these plans to do this kind of stuff. So I don't want to go on down that road, because that's just my personal opinion.
Yeah, well, I certainly wonder about it, because I know that there are cases where people feel a very close kinship to their contacts, I guess you would call them, and feel like they were ETs in a past life. It's funny, I went to a channeler once, I think it was Bashar, yeah, with Daryl Anka, and he's like, "Oh, you were an ET in a past life."
Wow.
And went to another channeler, just because this was a period of time where I was exploring channeling, and wanted some first-hand readings, and they all said the same thing. So I'm like, uh-oh, this is...
Yeah. Well, you even find that with musicians. I don't know if you've watched my music lectures, but if you take a look at Patti Smith, who was the first woman to sing on Saturday Night Live, she sung the Gloria song on Saturday Night Live. She believed she had been dropped. I'm not from here. Sun Ra, one of the first jazz guys, believed he was extraterrestrial. The guy who's basically was partly responsible for developing reggae music believed he was an alien. And John Denver believed he was from the constellation Lyra. And he actually wrote a song called Spirit. It was released after he dies. It talks about the stars in the constellation. So you get these weird connections where you got to look at the relationship as you're looking at. Why are these people being picked? Why these people, and what's actually going on?
Yeah, I think musicians are influencers. That's one reason, but obviously they're at a level, where they can sense these things. I think ETs do seem to be attracted to people who have alternative thinking in a certain sense.
Yeah.
Psychic might be one way of putting it.
Have you run into any musicians down in the LA area where there would be a lot of musicians where they've come to you and privately confess to you that they have experiences and stuff like that?
No, I can't say that I have. I have dealt with a few people who are celebrities, but
okay.
They wouldn't interview me firsthand. But I do know that they are involved in some of the cases in which I'm investigating.
Yeah, because that's what Roger Lear had said. He said, they're all right brain creative people, and we're here in Hollywood, and there's tons of them.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me a bit.
Yeah. Okay, Nikki, what do you want to ask next?
Well, we can go back and forth, I think, maybe between the two topics, but I did want to hear Preston talk about the plant gathering.
Yeah.
And because, well, this just falls in line with kind of Grant's other assistant, Sinead, and she's really into plant medicine. And so that's kind of made me start to pay attention to it a little more, because she and I have had some similar experiences, but from different perspectives in that sense. And I just think it's fascinating. The more I dig into it, I hear about healing ships that have plants on the inside of them. Last night I heard an experiencer speaking about a certain species that literally grows all their technology, like their cities that they live in, their homes, their ships, their car, like their personal vehicles. Everything is organic based. So I just find this fascinating right now, along with the healing aspect of these plants. You know, it plays into the healings and encounters. So
Yeah.
tell me more.
Yeah, I'm chomping at the bit. I did a big study of this because it was just interesting. I'm fascinated by all of this and the patterns in UFO contact cases. And what are UFOs? When I first got involved, I'm like, oh, they're abducting people, they're floating torture chambers, honestly. But then I wrote that healing book. I'm like, nope, they're floating hospitals. That's what they are. And now I'm like looking at some of these other plant cases, because UFOs are known to collect plants. This is very well documented in the literature. And like one case is just so funny to me. I think this took place in Puerto Rico. This young couple had a Swiss cheese plant on their front porch, a philodendron. You know, it's a common house plant. And their neighbor said, there was a UFO hovering over your house. And they didn't see it. But a couple of days later, the husband saw it. And then it was a couple of days after that, the wife wakes up because she hears something on the front porch. And it's these two little short humanoids picking all the leaves off of her philodendron. And which is a medicinal plant, by the way. Mm-hmm. So yeah, lots of cases like that. One case which I found really interesting was from Whitley Strieber. He joined a support group, and one of the ladies there, a cosmetologist from New York, said she had this very strange experience where she collected seeds and twigs and leaves and rocks for a year, and suddenly it all turned up missing. She's pretty sure the ETs took it. So there's a very strong collecting aspect. They love flowers. You know, the Maurice Mess case in France, they picked the lavender. Couldn't figure out where his lavender flowers were disappearing from. There was a case involving azaleas, one involving carnations. They also give advice. I found cases where ETs will actually give advice on how to grow plants. But for me, the most fascinating were people who reported seeing forests on board UFOs. And the first time I heard that was from a John Mack case. Actually, Betty Andreasen. I'm going to say she was the first. But I heard it again in John Mack. But when I read a case from Artie Six Killer Clark, I'm like, wow, here we go again. These things are floating terrariums. I mean, they're Noah's Ark in some cases, actually. There's zoos on board some of these UFOs as well. Mm-hmm. So,
a related question before I go back to Nikki. Related to this, I just did an interview with Terry. I think Nikki was with me. We did an interview with Terry Lovelace. And he describes, and so did Chris Bledsoe, and I just want to ask whether you've experienced this, is that when he got to the UFO, it looked like it was like, 100 feet across. And he goes inside and it's like 5 stories. It's like 10 times the size on the inside. Chris Bledsoe said the same thing when he told me how he flew the ship. It was 10 times the size inside as it was outside. And then if you look at an experiencer, I don't know if you ever talked to him, Ron Johnson out of Utah, he talks about the beings allow him in the spirit world, and his dead mother takes him to this building and says, when you die, you're going to get a room in this building. And he walks inside the building and he said, it's 10 times the size on the inside of the building as it was on the outside. And I said, that's what Chris Bledsoe said. That's what Terry Lovelace said. So if you've got these forests and stuff, have you heard this kind of thing where it's bigger on the inside of the craft than it is on the outside of the craft?
Yeah, I have several first-hand cases myself. One guy noticed the room kept changing size. Wow. Another guy, Bill Foster, he wrote a book about his experience. I talked to him.
Oh, good.
Black Triangle Abduction. And he asked ETs, how big is this thing? Because he couldn't figure it out. It was much. They said, oh, it's any size we need it to be. There's a case from Leonard Stringfield. This is a crash retrieval report or a guy's going to photograph a 20-foot saucer, photographs the outside, goes inside, it's much bigger than 20 feet. It's like a gymnasium.
Wow.
So I
What do
think
you think's going on there? Have you got any ideas? Because that's, especially when I heard about the spirit world, I started to wonder, are we actually talking a physical thing, or are we talking something that's on a different sort of dimension? Or so what do you think is, how did you interpret all these things where, because it doesn't make any sense at all if you listen to
No,
it.
I think what we're looking at is a technology that can transcend time and space. I mean, if you have something that moves beyond the speed of light, distance no longer means anything. So that equation, rate times time equals distance, is true. So it can be very confusing, I think. I hesitate to call these guys interdimensional because we are interdimensional, and all things on Earth are interdimensional. You know, the entire universe is interdimensional. Everything has interdimensional aspects, I guess would be the best way of putting it. We have a spirit body. I imagine ETs have a pretty good understanding of the spirit world and are able to, you know, go through it pretty easily. And it's weird because going on board a UFO is, in essence, going into another dimension. It's like having a near-death experience because you're essentially, you know, being pulled out of time in some of these cases. People have, I mean, not only is the UFO bigger on the inside, they will be there for a while. And then I returned, there was a healing case just like that. A lady was pulled from the wreck of a car accident. They gave her a 20-minute, 30-minute long healing session, told her she had died, healed her brain stem, healed her face up of cuts, said we need to leave some of these injuries for karmic reasons, which I thought was interesting, and put her back at the scene of the wreck. Yeah, and so that was compressing time. So I honestly think they are, I can't walk away from the extraterrestrial theory because it's just so logical to me. It explains the evidence best. And I think that, you know, even if they're time travelers or interdimensional, it doesn't preclude them being extraterrestrial.
Right. You know, we have been discussing this perception change with the size of crafts. And Grant, the only thing that I have kicked up is there is links to perception distortion to magnets, like massive magnetic fields can cause like a perception distortion. But, you know, you always hear about electromagnetism and crafts, or maybe radiation involved as well, until we get to Tic Tacs and we hear new theories on Tic Tacs. But Preston, in all your cases, I know you have two or a few books about being on board the craft. I think Onboard UFO Encounters is the one I'm thinking of right now. In some of those cases, do they describe where the light comes from or how these crafts are built or constructed? Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's very consistent. And that's fascinating to me because a lot of these people don't touch the UFO literature. They really don't. They're not interested. And like one guy I interviewed, he's like, I couldn't tell you where the light came from. Maybe it was coming in through the window, but it was definitely bright in there. And that's what pretty much all the witnesses describe as very well lit interiors, most of the time, not always. And as far as light source, they can't find any light source. But the interiors are very similarly described, always curved walls. You never get straight walls. I haven't gotten one case with, you know, corners, really. Right. And also I would say that portholes are described very much similarly without a frame. The wall turns transparent. And lots of real similarities in how people, like the craft is molded in one piece. No actual seams, hear that quite a bit. A central column. And the fact that sometimes entire craft can turn transparent. A couple of people use the word Wonder Woman's jet because literally you can see stars all around.
Yeah.
So these little red flags, I guess you might call them, are markers, help indicate the truthfulness or the veracity of a case to a certain extent, certainly.
Interesting. I like that. Grant, I got that question from you. We've been asking that to a lot of experiencers, but when you brought up Terry Lovelace, that reminded me, it kind of dinged with me when I was reviewing some of your stuff, Preston. You brought up Jim Schaefer, his case with healing, but he had also experienced flash burn from I think one of his encounters. Well, Terry Lovelace was just speaking to Grant and I about his flash burn incident as well. Is that something you've come across often with testimony?
Not to that severity, but eye injuries, I'd say, are probably the most common type of physiological reaction. You know, they fall into healings. Certainly, it's pretty common. I think injuries are a little more common, depending on how you categorize this stuff, because there's scars and bruises, and a lot of women have gynecological problems who are abductees. And Jim Schaefer had a lot of problems. He had flash burns, was diagnosed with like welder's arc in his eyes as a kid, twice. And once came back, he had puncture wounds, bruises. His foot was broken in one instance. So this is not always a nice phenomena. And then sometimes I, am posting on Facebook or something, and I'm talking about evil. Well, not evil, but grays aren't always nice. And there's the good ET guys come down on me. And then I'm like, well, here's 20 cases of people who've been healed. And people start telling me that grays are demonic. And I'm like, well, no, I don't think they are. I actually studied demonology because of this. And I'm not convinced they're demons by any stretch of the imagination.
Right. So what are your thoughts on this whole good, evil, bad, threat, non-threat? You seem to have a nice middle line there.
If you look at the cases, I think objectively what you see is a fairly strong bell curve, which is shifted towards the positive if you were to compare it to humanity. But the kidnapping thing is a real problem. So that I still grapple with that. That could be, as Cameron was talking about, a pre-life agreement. It seems like kind of a cop-out because a lot of abductees are like, no, I ripped that agreement up. Ultimately, I'm very hopeful about how all this turns out. I think ETs, like Bud Hopkins said, seem to be very interested in some of the best parts of being human. But yeah, there are healing cases. Many people I've talked to are absolutely right on with aliens, ETs. Most people I've talked to think they are ETs, by the way. There's a few who say, no, they follow the Jacques Vallée, Lauren Coleman, Jerome Clark crowd, which this is a mysterious intelligence which wears different masks. I think some of this is that, but mostly ET. And I don't think they're here to take over our planet. I really don't. They've been here forever. It seems like they've been manipulating our genes for a very long time and still are. If there's been an invasion, it's already taken place. We're probably all ETs because let's face it, some ETs look absolutely human. That raises serious questions about human origins. No, I'm not scared of UFOs. I think that in some cases people do have negative experiences though. And it's unfortunate, but there's, fairly regular bell curve, I would say. They're just like us in a lot of ways, most ways.
Right. I was just in a discussion last night that, is it fair to deem an entire species good or bad based on the actions of one or even a few members? We can't do that to humans. Why can we superimpose that on anything else with the phenomenon? So it's fascinating to me. Grant, did you have a question for now? I'm going to flip through my notes.
Okay. I want to go back to, you mentioned the near-death experience and the connection. Have you studied this? Because I've looked at it, a number of people looked at it, like near-death experience people will report the same sort of thing. They can't wear watches. They can burn out electronic equipment. Basically, if you were to take out the sort of the noun as to whether it's an experiencer or an abductee, it basically sounds like exactly the same phenomenon when you take the near-death experience. Have you looked at this whole idea about near-death, the connection between near-death experience and abductees?
Yeah, absolutely. Kenneth Ring did some fantastic research on this, comparing the two. I don't think they're the same phenomena. I think what we're looking at is an experience that seems to trigger people in the same way and has a number of really remarkable parallels that are amazing. One thing that I find very interesting is some people who are taken on board UFOs are given what amounts to a life review, often of their future events. And we see this with near-death experiences as well. But yeah, people will see past events in their past on board UFOs. It's very strange.
And what about dead people? Because we interviewed Sherry Wild. She talked about seeing Albert Einstein, Albert Schweitzer, Tesla on board the ship. And of course, I said to her, well, let me ask you a question. Were they physical? She says, I know where you're going with this. I mean, they may have been a hologram, but they look pretty real to me. And have you had this experience where people are dead relatives and dead dogs and stuff are brought on board the ship?
Never had it. No.
Never had it?
No, not really. One case that I've ever interviewed, I've interviewed a lot of people and it just has not come up. I don't get a lot of reptilian.
Brett Oldham's dog, he was very upset they brought the dog on there. I was on a show with Jerry Pippin, if you remember Jerry Pippin, and the one woman who she's on the same show as me. I tried to locate that one where her husband, they brought her dead husband on. She was furious. She hated the whole thing. She thought it was a scam. He had a birthmark. Pull up his shirt. I want to see it. And they pulled up the shirt and she couldn't believe it. She was furious that they brought her dead husband on there. So, but you haven't run into it. So that's basically what I wanted to ask. What about portals? I'm just about to release a book on portals and portal technology. Have you run into people who are describing these things popping in and popping out and portal technology?
I think there are some cases that I would say point towards that. There's one case on Catalina Island. I interviewed a Boy Scout and he saw this very large glowing object and it started ejecting multiple objects. And after this one went on for 2 hours, they counted some 200 objects. This is in an area that has produced a number of, large volume UFO sightings like that, which, involving 50 objects, 20, 100, 200, which is pretty rare in the literature, actually. I mean, there are quite a few, but it's not super common.
Have you heard the leaked Kit Green tape? Do you know who Kit Green is? From former control officer for the remote viewing program, CIA, physical, head of life sciences at CIA. There's a leaked tape that came out, and he's talking to an intuitive that people have threatened me if I name her. He says she's 95 to 100% accurate, and he's talking to her on this tape, and she talks about Catalina Island. There's a portal off the coast of Catalina Island, and there's these beings. She's describing it, and he's talking like she's totally normal. Like, okay, stop, and then what about this? And he's asking her questions. Absolutely fascinating. You mentioned Catalina Island. So you've heard the stories about Catalina. Do you think there's something to this idea about the underground base there and all this kind of stuff?
Yeah, and I'm kind of the guy. I got a book on this, on USOs in this area, and found out that, let's see, Barbara Lamb had cases, Ann Druffel, Robert Stanley, Bill Hamilton. I had a bunch of my own, so I started plotting them all on a map, and they're all clustered in the San Pedro Channel.
Wow. Did Green contact you?
No.
That's where the Nimitz happened. That's the whole deal, and the Nimitz thing. So it was off.
Yeah. I've talked to John Day and some of the other guys were involved in that, and it's right on the. It's part of this whole complex for sure. There's something going on with this area. It's been active since at least 1920. I've got cases really ramped up in the late 1940s, and it's been solid ever since. And so unusual because not only is it clustered there, there's cases involving, like I said, very large numbers of objects.
Wow.
That's
let me throw an ugly question at you. So we have this whole group. Where do you stand on? Do these guys know what's going on? Like to the stars? Do they have this high level understanding? What does the government really know? Do they have the technology? Do they know what's going on? Do they know who they're dealing with? What's your stand on that?
I wish I knew. can only speculate on some of these questions. But I do think from a military standpoint, our government's got to be freaked out with all of this because they are superior technology-wise and do represent a national security threat if they're shutting down our missiles and so on, abducting people. It's ridiculous for the government to have every study like Blue Book, Accounting Committee, and Robertson panel to say there's nothing to it, no national security threat, when they know there is. So there's been this very strong cover-up. They're obviously terrified about it. I think they can no longer cover it up because no one will ever believe them again. They'll lose all credibility and then lose control of the situation. I think that's probably the main driver behind this, that and the fact that they're neck deep in it. It's not just UFOs, it's a lot of stuff going on. And I think the ETs themselves are pushing a disclosure agenda because they're showing themselves in very brazen ways and pushing towards open official contact. This is what contactees are being told. So our government has painted themselves into a real corner here and are going to have some trouble disclosing. I don't know much about the To the Stars Academy and what they know, and the Pentagon is doing all these new releases. What they really know, I'm sure, is a lot more than that film. I think they have the bodies. I think they have the craft. So it's a little disingenuous and kind of a tease to just show me a film. I want to see the Roswell craft.
Can they turn the craft on? Because if you listen to Tom DeLonge when he talked about being at the skiff with the Lockheed guys, the head scientist said to him, how do you think it works? And he said, because then he was running around with Stephen Greer, he said, I think consciousness is involved. And the head scientist said, now you're talking. And for 45 minutes, that's all the guy wanted to talk about was consciousness. Have you looked into that sort of connection? Because the way I always looked at it is that may be what it is. They understand that this is a phenomena. They got the bodies, they got the craft, but they can't turn the craft on because it's a consciousness linked thing. It's like your cell phone. You need the fingerprint to turn the thing on. And so they understand, but they really have got not really the technology, because that's when you hear Kid Green, Jacques Vallée, this core story thing. We've got bodies, we got crafts, but we can't back engineer it. Or Kid Green or Eric Davis saying we shut the program down in 1989 because we weren't getting anywhere. So have you looked into the whole consciousness aspect in terms of what they know about this?
As far as government, no, I have heard what you're talking about here, that there are some craft and they open up, there's no engine in them. There's nothing there. So some they can't even open. I think they've probably figured out some of this because I have been told that a good 10% of what people are seeing is our own, 20%. There's a lot of talk about triangular craft right now being government. But I'm gonna say most of it is not. I do think it is about consciousness, because this is certainly what the people I've interviewed who have been taken on board craft say. And a lot of them have been taken to the engine room, seriously, and taught how to fly these things.
Yeah.
And one lady I talked to fairly frequently, and she's like, yeah, it's all about consciousness. You have to be an empath. You have to be psychic. This is why they're choosing certain people of a certain type, and they train them how to do it. And those little helmets aren't going to help. There's, it's kind of an AI type device that you connect with, is what she said. The craft itself was intelligent. And we do get cases of people feeling like these craft are alive, living beings.
I'm glad to hear you say that, because I've got 50 cases. I had my first one in 2013. And Chris Bledsoe's one. There's all sorts of them where they talk about you put your hand on a panel or a ball or a thing on a wall, and you become one with the craft, and whatever you think is what the craft does, and the craft is alive. So you've got the same sort of, how many cases do you think you would have run into like that? Where they're, because the question is, like, the first woman I heard, she was in her 70s. She's like 75 years old. And I'm thinking to her, like, are you nuts, lady? Like, why would they let you fly the craft? I mean, come on, this doesn't make any sense at all. It's like, totally stupid. And yet they're talking, are you probably, let me ask you if you got the kids who were kids, when they're kids, they're sitting in a circle. Terry Lovelace has this. You're sitting in a circle and they're teaching them to levitate balls and telepathically move stuff around on the floor. You've got that kind of stuff as well, yeah?
I sure have, yep. Yeah, definitely they are teaching people how to fly these craft. They put them in the chair. Sometimes it's little kids, they do this. Sometimes it's adults, or they just, set them next to the controls and while they're operating it, show them how it works. That's what one guy told me from Louisiana. He's like standing between them, and they're explaining, and he's in the craft, and it's darting around at right angles, like he'd seen UFOs doing this. And he had the distinct impression these were young teenage grays who were learning how to do it because they were kind of arguing and having fun about which way do we go? How do we do this? And doing maneuvers, which would kind of explain a lot of cases where these guys are chasing cars down the road and doing joyriding type behavior.
Go ahead, Nikki.
I love it. That's great. That makes me smile because it makes me think of my teenage days. And yeah, we did all sorts of silly stuff.
Yeah, the cars
with
are
our vehicles.
Cars are being chased down the road by UFOs over and over and over and over again. It's a very common behavior. And I think these are young ETs.
We used to try to play car tag. Have you heard of that? Yeah, see how close we could get to each other. So it's like, I can imagine that in the sky. So sure. But we're talking about tech for a little while, and I was wondering if maybe you could tie this into your people who had been healed. Have you come across stories maybe from doctors where they have received information once they've been healed, or maybe they could use it in their field to maybe develop a specialized medicine or treatment?
Not to the extent that I would like. There's been some cases where like, oh, cancer is a virus, or they'll teach people, they'll give people information, certainly. They are healing a lot of doctors. A lot of people do come away with the feeling that they can do Reiki or hands-on healing. That's very common. But as far as providing information, well, sometimes they'll give dietary advice. One lady was told she was getting too fat by the Greys. She was not happy.
I like that story. That made me laugh too. It ties in. They have a sense of humor sometimes, I think, or they're not afraid to be blunt.
One case which really actually made me laugh was a lady who was having kidney failure. And this was diagnosed by her doctor. He's like, get to the emergency room right now. She had been having trouble urinating for like a day or two. And she went home and called her friends, called her family, called her co-workers and her boss and said, pray for me. I'm having a crisis. And she fell asleep in her bed and woke up, and there were these short brown humanoids massaging her belly in her area. For a while, she kept passing in and out of consciousness. Woke up the next day, she was fine. She went to the doctor, and the doctor's like, well, oh my God, I must have misdiagnosed you. I don't know what happened. And she told everyone it was angels. She kind of knew it wasn't, but it was a month later or 2 months later, about there, where she was taken on board. She was in a craft this time, round walls, being examined. There was an instrument I've heard many times where it projects your organs in living color as a hologram. And they said, look, your kidneys are fine. And then they showed her liver, which was all dark and spotty, and said, your liver is having problems. You need to stop drinking Diet Coke. So yeah, they give dietary advice. They told one guy,
just Diet Coke, nothing else, just Diet Coke.
They told one guy, you need to stop smoking marijuana. This is not the life we had planned for you.
Oh.
That was after they'd taken
too far. He took it too far.
Yeah, a couple of cases where people have this black goo removed from their lungs, and both cases, the ET said the same thing. This is our gift to you.
Now, that's a crossover one. I've heard that in the paranormal world as well, where it's been like a spirit healing instead of an ET healing. Yeah, so I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, I found, get this, cases of people healed by lightning. Lightning is most likely going to kill you. But there's actually some 50, 100 cases of people cured of paralysis, cancer, blindness, deafness, a whole list of things you would not believe. It's very similar to people being cured by beams of light, which is one of the main methods ETs use.
Right. So with these healing stories, I know we talk about video physical evidence. And I don't know why this just popped into my head. Maybe it was about a year ago, Dr. Greer released a video of or a still from the video of a being that supposedly healed the hearing of somebody. So I'm sure that story didn't necessarily surprise you about the healing aspect of it, but have you come across evidence of people being able to capture beings during a healing? Or those?
Not beings so much. Probably the best case I have of that would be Jim Schaefer of Winnipeg, Canada, whose case we already kind of mentioned. He had the broken foot and all of this, but he did have a healing, which was really remarkable. He had been having all these orbs flying around his house. He's caught some really amazing evidence.
Oh, yeah.
Photographic, audible evidence as well. And filmed this orb as he's going to bed one night, and it comes swooping into his room and enters his chest. And it's caught on film. I've seen the video. It's on his YouTube somewhere, I believe. And he goes to bed, wakes up the next morning. He had been diagnosed with a cyst, actually a cancerous tumor on his neck, and it was protruding. And he was about to have surgery. They always wait to the last minute. It's really bizarre. And he goes to the mirror and it's gone. Goes to get surgery and they can't find any cancer. They removed necrotic tissue, but it was gone. And
wow.
He's the only person who's ever caught his healing. I think, it was a healing orb. Because in a lot of cases, people describe these healing orbs.
Grant, you've come across quite a few orbs where people talk about the orbs coming out of their body, and I might have had one fly out of my face during our disclosure panel discussion. So it does make you wonder. And even Dr. Shirley Ryan talks about the orbs kind of canvassing the environment. It's like maybe they're coming in looking for, it's like, all right, who can we heal? What can we do? what good can we spread? So I like these stories. They make me happy. And
yeah, orbs are weird because we don't know if they're spirits or ETs in a lot of these cases.
I think they're in that both category. I think it's that realm where they are. So
the people I've as you know, I've dealt with a lot of orb people who have collections of thousands of pictures. They all believe one thing. They always say, "Can you see the face in this orb?" And you go, "No, not really." But they all absolutely believe that there's a face in the orb, and they can see it very clearly. And so there's this connection, and they will have the different interpretation, whether it's an angelic being or an ET or a spirit or a dead person or whatever. But they all believe it. There's this direct pattern that they all firmly believe they can see faces in the orbs. So it's a new area, which maybe I can ask you a question. Do you see a pattern? Because you talked about a lot about the plant stuff. But a lot of the plant stuff goes back many years. And I brought up this thing where, we used to get, when I started in 75, there was a lot of landing trace cases. Stan always talked about them, they'd land and leave the tripod marks. But now we really don't have so much of that anymore. Do you see a pattern in terms of, like, the 1950 flying saucers look different than the 1980 flying saucers, that they seem to be another triangles? That they're sort of changing the pattern of how they're appearing? Or in the old days, you'd have angel hair. That doesn't happen anymore. And I would like to get your feedback on that as to whether you think the phenomena is changing as we go along.
I'm not convinced it is, but I'm going to leave myself open-minded to it, because the one change that I find a lot of difficulty explaining or understanding is the airship wave to the modern age. Because that was a pretty remarkable wave of sightings, which has never really been fully explained. And they don't look like modern UFOs. They look more like dirigibles and with propellers. And so that I've always found very curious. But I think from 1947 onward, what we were dealing with was a perplexing variety of craft. And I know we have our own styles of automobiles and planes and so on. But we don't see like regular duplicate cases of UFOs that look exactly alike a lot. We get, you know, classic flying saucers with all these minor variations. We get spheres and triangles and manta ray shapes and, you know, tetrahedrons and boxes and pyramids and snakes and anomalous lights and clouds. And it's driving me a little bit batty, to be honest, because you can't categorize it.
Do you think they can? Do you think they can actually change? Because I'm about to go back out where I started in 1975. I haven't been back there for probably 35 years. I'm really not interested in sightings, but going back to where all this stuff happened, and I know two of the main sightings had 5 close encounter sightings, but in both of those, the object in 2 of the 5, the object changed. So it started as one object, flashing light in the sky coming at us, and then it turns into this red sort of plasma object. And the second one, it was a big white arc welding light, and as it came around, then it turned into a triangle. So do you think they have this ability to actually sort of morph what they're doing and what they're appearing as?
Yeah, I would say that's probably not true. It's very easy to generalize in this phenomena. And I think we might be dealing with UFOs that are not, you know, classic ETs, and could be something else that has a shape-shifting ability. And I think as far as ETs, I think they probably have that ability too, some of the more advanced ones, because we have cases of little balls of light coming down and then expanding into large craft, or vice versa. Some of these craft are moving through trees. That shouldn't be possible. That's kind of weird. Or turning slowly transparent, or are transparent. They're not fully physical as we would think of it, I guess. And yeah, there's cases. One guy I talked to had a UFO turned into a helicopter. And I'm like, look into that. And I'm like, there's a bunch of cases of that. It's not just one. You know, people think it's a car. It's mimicking a car. And then or often mimicking a star. One guy was going from town to town, and whenever he drove into town to point it out, it would go way, way up and pretend to be a star. Like, that's it, that's that thing, it's following me.
Yeah. Which is we when we did the interview with Terry Lovelace, he started talking about this, where he's got 167 helicopter photographs of helicopters flying around, and then he says, I've got 7 of them with UFOs in them. And I said, oh, so does Jeff Sall, so does Tony Bintz. And I actually had it on Facebook at one time, and I said, has anybody got a low-flying helicopter following an abductee around that doesn't have a UFO in it? And it was kind of weird that you find these photographs of low-flying helicopters and they got a UFO in them. And so, you know, that was something I found when you mentioned the helicopter thing. That's where I start to think, like, Chris Bledsoe had the one over his house that his father saw. It was hovering like 20 feet above the house. Chris wasn't at home. And the pilots were there, and you see like this almost direct pattern that experiencers report these helicopters. So is it a helicopter? How do they know? Does the government have this technology to actually produce all these helicopters? Or in Great Britain, Tony Bintz is in London, England. So the helicopter, you've looked at that as well, that this may not be what people really think it is. Yeah,
to a certain extent. You know, and I've certainly looked into my labs as well, military abductions, and there are some researchers who believe that the abduction phenomena isn't real. And that it's government mind control type of stuff, which I don't subscribe to. I'm fairly well convinced that it's far too widespread for that. And you know, I talk to people who've never gone public, and they never will, who had an experience when they were an 11-year-old paper boy, or, you know what I mean? Just nobody the military would ever target. There is a kind of a large percentage of experiencers who do work in the military, and I'm not sure if that's just the way, you know, because the military is pretty pervasive, but sometimes it seems like there's a lot of people who, you know, whose fathers worked in intelligence. I'm like, hey, got a couple of cases like that in my latest book, Onboard UFO Encounters. Yeah, so you've seen that as well. There's connection between the military and the kids of the people in the military that you don't understand what it is, but yeah, there is definitely a connection there, correct? Mm-hmm. Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, I worry about it a little bit because I don't know to what extent our military is involved in this, but I do feel like it's neck deep, and I do feel like there's probably been diplomatic relations, so to speak, and that our government has failed to be truthful, forthcoming, or transparent. And so the ETs are doing a sort of a grassroots movement and saying, all right, if you're not going to release the technology, we will take people to the control room. You know, if you're not going to stop polluting, we're going to take people on board and let them know the dangers of nuclear proliferation and pollution and war and aggression. And this is exactly what they're doing. So, yeah, I wonder why they're so interested in us. That's kind of my main question. They love all things human. So what is so fascinating about us that abductions are still happening?
Well, do you see the thing, like, do you see the big wave starts in sort of after we detonate the atomic bomb? Do you see that connection? And that connects to the story about the screen. The 39% of people that from the free survey say that they were shown the screen where, you know, they see the environmental, they see the wave, they see the fire, you know, nuclear devastation. I guess you've got a lot of those cases where people describe being forced to watch this sort of screen. And that may be where they become very sort of, you know, ecological crazy people, or, you know, civil rights people, that they're affected by this whatever they're shown on board the ship.
Yeah, I wonder about it because, you know, sometimes they'll give prophecies, UFOs, and they don't often come true. And I'm wondering if part of this is scare tactics, but I don't think so, because this message first came with the contactee era, which some researchers have like, nah, that's not real. Those guys were all hoaxers. Yeah. I'm not sure they were. And the Greys come along, and they've got the same message. So the praying mantis. And as far as the atomic connection, yeah, because what's going on now on our planet is unprecedented. Yeah, there's been activity for forever. We know it goes way back because of petroglyphs and hieroglyphics and, you know, Middle Age cave, or not cave paintings, but wood carvings and Renaissance paintings and so on. But like what's going on now since 1947, really it's the 1950s when we started having onboard experiences. Yeah. There's nothing like that, not at this, with these numbers. And I don't think you can say, oh, people weren't educated, they didn't write this down, they didn't report it. We would have something, I think, to indicate that there were these Greys coming in such large numbers, abducting people and physically examining them. There's just nothing like that. So I wonder about that and what that is all leading to. But ultimately, it feels to me like it's part of this very long-term plan of genetically intervening. Because we have all kinds of writings that go way back that point towards that as well. And here we are seeing it again, full on, hybrid babies.
Where do you think the hybrids are going?
They're adults now, I know that. I've talked to several people who've talked to their adult hybrid children.
Yeah. And
I think what we're getting is probably a general bleed through into the population to sort of improve psychic awareness, perhaps. Mm-hmm. And yeah, because people are claiming to be hybrids already and they're living among us. I think there are human ETs probably living among us. And this is why I'm not afraid of an invasion, because it's already taken place. Mm-hmm. They're going to invade by just genetically uplifting us. I really think, here's an interesting point that I'd like to make. Our lifespan as humans has essentially doubled over the last 100 years. And I think the ETs are very interested in this and could be partly responsible, because there's a case from Florida of this guy, Jim Law, I think it's in Gainesville, Florida, who had a hernia. The Greys show up. He's seen him 100 times. He's now not afraid anymore, not really. And so he's talking to him. He's like, heal my hernia. If you're going to take me, heal my hernia. And they said, oh, we know of this problem and we will fix it. We will repair it. And they did right there. And he's like, oh, okay, why are you abducting me? Why do you keep taking me? And they said, we are interested in your genetic propensity to live a long time. And his grandfather was 106 at the time, still working hard. So, and I've got many people tell me that, oh, I'm 70 years old. I went to the doctor. I've got the heart of a 15-year-old. I think it's because of these guys, or, you know, health upgrades is what they give people.
Right.
Case after case of that.
Wow.
Tune-ups. I come across that as well.
Yeah, it's nice to know.
I have to ask you about the most important thing.
Uh-oh.
Because I have one of two remaining in Illinois, 7 miles from me, and that's drive-in movie theaters.
Yeah, I had a feeling you were leading to this.
I was just there a few weekends ago, so tell me the skinny, give me the statistics. I do
Yeah.
take weird photos there sometimes where people have auras or those tricky stars that should be a star, but they look really low. So it's
Yeah,
called Sky View Theater too. So, I mean, it's nothing but sky, corn country.
yeah, this is a funny research project that I started, which is UFOs that hover over drive-in theaters. Because I started looking into what attracts UFOs. Did a whole book on schoolyards. That's definitely what I would call a UFO attractor. And in my Not From Here series of books, I identified a bunch more, like mines, metal mines, or
Really?
rocket launches, cemeteries, graveyards of all things, prisons, and so on. And turns out movie theaters are definitely one of them. I first found out that when I interviewed a lady years and years ago by the name of Claudia, who was at the Paramount Theater in California, and this UFO hovered right next to the screen for 5 minutes, scared the daylights out of everybody. This is like, 20 feet up, as big as the screen, very close, being viewed by hundreds of people. There is nothing in the literature like this.
No, why isn't that on CNN or Fox News? That's way
Well,
more exciting than
yeah.
Nimitz.
People they call the newspapers and they can't get anywhere.
I'll give you a thing. I don't know if you've seen it. The head singer for Flaming Lips. There's a video of him talking about the drive-in movie theater, how he got dragged into UFOs. I think he's 5 or 6, and he's trying to describe it. And the other guys are throwing stuff at him. Shut up! I don't want to hear this stupid thing. And he's trying to describe this as a kid, the drive-in movie theater, how he got obsessed with UFOs, with the UFOs appeared. So it's kind of interesting because you were talking about music before.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, these are not normal. These aren't random flybys. There's a certain number of cases that are, but these objects are targeting theaters, coming right down next to the screen and staying there, and sometimes putting on an actual show. I mean, seriously. There'll be a fleet of 8 of them, and they do the musical chairs, or a mothership, and it releases a bunch of craft, or it'll fly around the screen. Usually it just sits right over the screen. Sometimes it flashes lights. It will affect the speakers in cases, or the screen itself, causing panic. People are tearing off the little speakers, or the ones that we used to have,
Yeah.
Yeah.
100 cases. I couldn't believe it.
Wow.
That's cool. You mentioned the school. Let's go to the school, because I've been fascinated. I actually tried to get someone to write a book on this because I didn't have time. And then you go and do the book, the school. So let's go through some of the schools. Everybody sort of knows the Ariel School, but let's go through some of the other cases of UFOs over top of schools, and why would they sort of appear like Ariel School? They were given messages, but in the, correct me if I'm wrong, the Australian thing, they just sat there behind the school and didn't really do anything and just waited for everybody to see them and then took off. So go through the schools and what you think is significant about why they're picking schools and showing themselves to these little children.
Yeah, the parallels to the drive-in theater cases are astounding. They both started in 1950, pretty much. There was an early case in Prestonburg, Kentucky. Some 40 or 50 students were on the playground when 2 UFOs swooped down and scared the living daylights out of them. And then swooped down an hour later, and there's 4 of them this time, come even lower. And this is when it started. And it was fairly regular ever since. And mostly elementary schools. Of the 100 cases I collected, 50% were elementary schools. And they would appear once, twice a year, sometimes right after another. There's 2 very famous angel hair cases. One at Marysville, Ohio. UFOs dropped a huge volume of angel hair on the playground. And 1 year exactly later, they go to North Carolina and do the same thing. It's a clear display. These objects are hovering at very low level for long periods of time, and a sort of a in-your-face behavior. Landing, by the way, in 30% of the cases, their landings are humanoids, which is remarkable.
How many have humanoids? How many of the cases involve beings coming out?
About 10 to 15 at least, but 30% involved landings. And yeah, quite a number of humanoid cases. I was really surprised. I talked to one lady firsthand. She had a case at Point Elementary School in St. Louis, Missouri, I believe it was. And this was right on the heels of the Hillsdale, Michigan college sighting, which
Okay.
was, and she was on the playground with her friends and saw what they thought was an ice cream truck. It wasn't. They also saw these little weird footprints on the ground. That's what they were first talking about. Like, what's that? And they see this ice cream truck in the forest, and they run up to it, and it's a saucer, and there's this being standing there and staring right at them. And they were, 50 feet away, 20 feet away. And it kept its eyes locked on them as it backed up and entered its craft. And at that point, the teacher came up behind them and pulled them away. But most of the people on the playground at that point saw this craft, which was very bright, had bright lights. So this is what we're seeing. There's case after case, cases in Scotland.
You said that was what school in St. Louis, Missouri? I'm only an hour from there. That sounds like a day trip to me.
Yeah, I found it on Google. It's Point Elementary School. It's still
Nice.
there. There was a little farm next to it. It's much more, urbanized now. Still a suburban area though. And yeah, so many cases of them hovering over schools. It's really amazing.
I'll definitely look into that. I have a whole theory of sightings in that St. Louis area, kind of connected to the Cahokia Mounds area, and then one which is in Illinois, right across the Mississippi. But then from that Cahokia Mounds area, the sighting reports, I call it the channel, from the mounds up to Chicago. It's almost like a sightings highway. It's amazing.
I've got cases from there, yeah.
Yeah, there really is. So I'm going to check out this Point Elementary School too. But I think we're hearing a lot about schools lately too, and that with the phenomenon that's about to be released, and it's the Aerial School, I think, is in that one. And they're just, you mentioned it with the contactees, the early contactees having this environmental message. I think we see it with the school children as well. Did you come across that or is it kind of limited to cases where they get messages like that?
Yeah, it's mostly adults. I did not find any really, except for the Aerial School. But I do find it interesting that there was, Greta Thunberg caused this worldwide movement with children ditching school to save the world, save the environment, which became, quite a thing. Millions of kids were doing this, and I'm not sure it's a coincidence. I think ultimately the ET's agenda with that is to convince kids that UFOs are real, and it's a very effective and kind of sneaky way to sort of slip this in without causing huge waves of publicity, but still be really effective, because now what we see, certainly with younger generations, is a very widespread belief.
Oh, absolutely. UFOs. So you think it's sort of like an acclimatization or a saturation maybe of belief over generations?
Yep, preparing us for contact. I feel like that's what's ultimately going on, because it's just like the drive-in theater ones. I was counting up, the 100 cases I documented. There's probably 10 times that, because most people never report their sightings. Could be 100 times that, easily.
I agree with you there. Like, it's just so funny because I often wonder how much influence my hobby here has over my soon-to-be 5-year-old. But then I turn on his videos that he watches, and everything that streams, they have a UFO cartoon or an alien cartoon. Netflix just launched one, and it's, little green aliens, and they're reporters, and they come to Earth to do reports on what's going on Earth to send home for a news show.
Yeah, one time the neighborhood kid, I was visiting a friend, the neighborhood kid comes running in, he says, "I'm going to go to Area 51 and shoot aliens. Bye." And I turned to my friend, I'm like, "What is he talking about?" He's like, "Oh, Area 51 is an arcade."
Yeah. Oh. I've come across that too. My son knows more about Area 51 than I do because of this game. And yeah, I'll say they've definitely been indoctrinated. They're it's nothing for them, for young kids or even millennials to just believe in the phenomenon, that they know it's been covered up, and yeah, they believe it. They want answers too.
Yeah,
So.
which is why our government has to disclose, because we know they want to remain in control. And I think they're at a crossroads here, like, uh-oh. You know, there's been a lot of pressure on a lot of sides.
A couple more questions, Preston. What case do you think has sort of been overlooked? What case do you think is like a real significant case that people should pay attention to?
Oh, there's so many really obscure cases that I love. There was one book by Walter Webb, Incident at Buff Ledge, which was a great case with outside witnesses, a multiple witness abduction case, had a lot of information in it. I thought that was a great case. I think most of them have been overlooked. There's some that have really captured people's attention, like the Travis Walton case. But there are a lot of cases with an enormous amount of information in them, which is kind of my whole impetus trying to put out these cases of first-hand accounts.
That's our job, yeah. I'm glad you're done. What are you working on now?
Well, just put out drive-in UFOs, and working on another one very much like onboard UFO encounters and inside UFOs, about people who've had very close contact. Also working on another Not From Here series about weird UFO cases that kind of defy the standard model of contact, I guess, or weird outlying cases with weird patterns and stuff. So, and got lots of books lined up. And one on out-of-body experiences, another on ghosts, another on psychic stuff.
How does all that fit in in terms of out-of-body experiences, psychic? Is there a connection between the two?
I think for sure. Yeah, but all of this stuff is, like we talked about with near-death experiences, to a certain extent connected. I remember getting dragged into Bigfoot. I'm like, no, I'm not looking into Bigfoot. I'm not going to do it until this guy calls me up and said he had a UFO land in his backyard. And the next day, he had a Bigfoot encounter in the same place. He lives in a rural area. Not my first UFO or that was my first, but not my last UFO Bigfoot case. They intersect.
We all get sucked into Bigfoot.
And it's true. I ended up writing a book. I mean, it's a true phenomenon, and there's paranormal aspects to that too. I had a severe haunting case I was working on. They had a UFO drop down over their apartment, their haunted apartment. They thought it was absolutely connected to what was going on because they were having a hellacious time with ghosts that were trying to possess them. So yeah, I've looked into all of this stuff because it's absolutely connected. One case that always comes to mind is an airline pilot who had UFOs surrounding him. He lands and he's questioned by government agents. They get all the story and then they ask him, have you had any out-of-body experiences following your sighting? And the pilot was like, what? Yeah, I know. Yeah, he suddenly had a bunch following this sighting.
Who asked him that?
These were government agents. They wouldn't identify themselves.
Okay, wow.
And I find that fascinating because, I began UFO research in 1986. Well, is when it kind of started. 88 really is when it ramped up. And that's when I got really into out-of-body experiences and learning how to do them and the whole deal. So I wonder if that's a coincidence. I don't think so.
You've done out-of-body experience?
Yeah, one of my books is the only autobiographical book I've written so far, and is all about that. I learned how to do it following the death of my mother, and I actually got really good at it.
Wow.
And it's something I cannot recommend enough. It's a natural human talent. Everyone should at least look into it, try it, or doing it every night anyway. We just don't remember. And you can visit the other side. You can visit your deceased relatives, your spirit guides, learn about past lives, go to healing temples. It's crazy what you can do, and people are overlooking it.
Wonderful. I love hearing you say that. Yeah.
It's so easy. So fun.
Grant, I'm noticing a pattern with more researchers that I talk to. It's like we all start in this near-death experience world before we get slapped with ufology. And you can't help but link the two after decades.
Yeah.
Preston, I have one last question. Are you a experiencer yourself? I mean, you just mentioned out of body experience, but would you classify yourself as an experiencer?
I guess so. To a limited extent, you know, I've interviewed a lot of people, and I certainly have no memories of being on board and physically examined and so on, or hybrid babies, though I'm not opposed to having babies. But I have had a lot of sightings. I have,
Yeah.
and really none growing up, but it's in my family for sure, because some of my direct family members have had entity sightings. So that's a red flag. And had a very close-up sighting of a little orb, which came in front of my windshield. Had another one after interviewing this lady who had been abducted by grays and said she had hybrid babies, and said she reached out and kicked one and broke its neck and all this stuff. I was transcribing the interview. I'm thinking, wonder if this lady is for real. And I had a very strong impulse to go onto the roof of my condo that I could not resist. And this UFO appears instantly and says, "It's us," and literally blasts me with this message. "You don't believe, watch this." And so I've had stuff like that a number of times.
Yeah, that's an experience. I'd say that's an experience.
That counts? All right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And yes.
Actually, what made me think to ask you is when you started talking about 26 books and you're writing another book. And I was like, oh, I wonder if this is some sort of experience or download where, you know, it's part of how you get your message out is writing books.
Yeah, they'll show themselves to me every now and then, you know, as encouragement. I feel like they are aware on a really weird level. One time I did ask a lady to go on TV, public access, you know, nothing big. The UFOs showed up and they're like, "No, we don't want you to go on TV yet." I'm like, "Oh, okay." And another time I was interviewing a guy. He calls me the next day. He says, "A UFO landed on the street in front of the house while we were on the phone." His son had told him.
Wow.
Wow.
Last question for me, and that deals with this admission thing. Do you have the synchronicities where the books sort of come to you and it's sort of like, do this one, now do this one, like things are falling into place?
Yeah, for sure. It's really amazing how sometimes you'll get information from people. Like when I was doing schoolyard UFOs, wrapping it up, and I started getting a bunch of people just contacting me with schoolyard encounters who did not know. You know, I was looking for them. I hadn't put out a social media request at that point yet.
Wow.
Which I like to do. And incredible synchronicities for sure. Put me like in touch with Stephen Greer. I would never in a million years, because I wasn't going to pay for his lecture. and the newspaper called me up and said, "We'll pay for it. We have no idea why we're doing this."
Wow.
I've written one article. They don't publish UFO articles. So weird stuff like that for sure.
That's powerful. And is your family supportive about all this stuff? And
mostly in the beginning, it was really hard for them, but it was really hard for me. I was a skeptic.
Yeah.
But I was also scandalized and frankly pissed off at a number of family members for not telling me what had happened to them. Yeah. And friends and coworkers, people I'd loved and trusted, were keeping secrets. So it did cause a divide. My dad never came around to the day he died. Yeah. But you know, I've got a lot of siblings, and they all came around.
Okay. Beautiful. Anything else you want to ask Nikki before we shut down here?
Not ask, but if you have any advice for me on bugging your family, I've just kind of started, and I've kind of hit or miss between my aunts or uncles. Some of them are like, "Why didn't you just ask me?" And then others are like, "Oh yeah, yeah." Like, I just set plans to speak with my uncle, because he has a Vietnam experience or two that he's finally decided to share with me. So I'm excited for that.
I finally got my brother to talk by getting him drunk. So that
Trickery.
worked. Seriously, he wouldn't, and he never would talk about some of his experiences.
All right, so booze. Show booze. Gotcha.
But ultimately, I think if you just leave it open-ended,
you know, what unexplained, has anything unexplained happened to you?
Yeah,
and
that's
lead towards that.
brilliant. I think as broad and open-ended as you can be at this point in the beginning is probably best. But I've dropped hints on a couple talks that I'm gonna speak with certain family members, and they've even like messaged me and they're like, am I the aunt that you mentioned? Is there something you have to ask me? And I'm like, we'll see. I like to do this stuff face to face. So I have them all scared right now, I think is what's going on. But thank you so much. This was a wonderful chat, Preston, and I'll continue following you on Facebook and reading along with your 26, 27, 28 books. Keep them coming.
Hey,
Beautiful.
thanks.
Beautiful. Yeah, we may even contact you for another. I didn't realize you'd done some very important stuff. I'm going to have to do some research on your books, and maybe we'll do another session, because you are, there's not many, if you look, I think you probably agree with, there's not that many researchers who are really sort of out there digging and getting cases and building stuff. Most people are, they're into opinion and arguing about, you know, the Travis Walton thing, the Nimitz thing. They're sort of into talking about five different cases, where I think you've gathered a lot of material that shows some very direct patterns. So hopefully we can do it again. I'm sure Nikki's going to give me some more material. We'll do some research, and maybe we can dig some more subjects. You've got a lot of material that I think people should know about.
Hey, yeah, thanks. I really appreciate that. Yeah, I do agree. We need more UFO researchers who are really doing the legwork. And talking heads is all fine and good, but let's bust this wide open. It's going mainstream. We're very close to it.
Beautiful. And I guess this is my last question. Desta and I help people put their books out, because, you know, there's a lot of people who sort of, they get their story and then they want to do a book. Or I encourage them. I say, have you written it down? No. I think you should write it down, and maybe we'll help you self-publish your book. So we help people do it. And of course, everybody thinks they suddenly get a messiah complex, and they're figure like, you know, they're going to make $1 million. So you've done 26 books. Are you a millionaire?
No, I am not. Unfortunately, I'm not. But I do pay for my habit, so there's that. No, not. I work full time, or I did until recently.
There you go. So that's a little hint for people who. It's good to get your story out, but people today should realize that it's easy and cheap to get your story out, but people think that they're going to make $1 million, and I'm glad you sort of pointed out to them that it's a good thing to do, but it may not make you wealthy. A lot of people sort of think that you put a book out and you're wealthy in it. So I'm glad you cleared that up.
I blame the Harry Potter author. What was her name? She ruined it for all authors. Everybody thinks you're all millionaires now.
Well, she was a billionaire. She was a billionaire. She got it in a download. I did that in my Inspired book. I told the story how she got the spontaneous download on the train going into London from Manchester, and she didn't have a piece of paper, and she's saying, oh, and I had no paper, and all this stuff is flooding into my head. And so interesting.
Wow, I didn't know that story. See,
yeah. Yeah, she's a billionaire. Okay, thanks, Preston. And I definitely think we're going to do it again, because Nicole has sort of got a real eye on you and your research, and she'll keep me updated, and I'll do some research, and we'll be a little more prepared to ask some questions about some of the really interesting stories you've told us. Thanks.
Yeah, yay. Sounds like fun.
Beautiful.
Yeah,
how can they contact you? Like your Facebook, are you under Preston Dennett, or how should people contact you?
Yeah, I do have a website. If you Google my name, it should take you there. I'm also on Facebook. I'm on Twitter. I'm not a huge Twitterer, but I am keeping up, trying. And yeah, just Google my name, and you can contact me through my website.
Beautiful.
Your YouTube
Thanks for your work.
well, right? YouTube, Preston Dennett.
Yeah, my YouTube channel is taken off, so I'm having a lot of fun with that.
I subscribed.
Hey, thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, I'm putting out a lot of my research on that, because people have such, they're so visual and they don't want to read a book. I'm trying to put my books out on audio now, and so all these
Ooh.
different ways trying to reach people, because who has time anymore?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, you gotta go with what the people are doing. You can't stay at the old pattern. You got to figure out how to get the message out and go with it.
Exactly.
I appreciate
Wonderful.
your time, and I really appreciate the research you're doing. You're doing a fantastic job.
Hey, thanks. Hearing that
Okay.
from you is a great compliment. So thanks very much. I feel the same about you.
Beautiful.
Thank you, Desta. Lurking in the background.
Bye, guys. Thanks.
Okay. We'll be in touch.
All
Thanks.
right.
Thanks
Yep.
so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.